Marcus Chen watched his son David shuffle through the door of their small apartment, shoulders slumped in defeat. The 17-year-old dropped his testing tablet on the kitchen counter with a hollow clatter that seemed to echo through the cramped living space. Outside their window, the massive Galactic Education Center loomed against the artificial sky of Station Kepler-7, its crystalline spires reaching toward the dome that protected this human colony from the vacuum of space. "How did it go today?" Marcus asked, though David's expression already told the story. "Failed again," David muttered, not meeting his father's eyes. "Physical coordination test, cognitive reasoning assessment, even the basic empathy evaluation. The Zephyri and Proctor said I scored lower than their youngest children." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. For 3 years now, since humanity had been granted probationary membership in the Galactic Confederation, human children had been required to pass standardized tests designed by alien civilizations. These tests determined everything from educational opportunities to career paths, even basic citizenship rights within the Confederation. The problem was simple: humans consistently failed. "The Vorthan administrator pulled me aside afterward," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said humans might be the first species in Confederation history to lose their membership before the probationary period ends. She said we're fundamentally incompatible with galactic society." Marcus had heard similar assessments from other parents. The Galactic Confederation consisted of 7 major species, each having evolved under different conditions that shaped their abilities. The Zephyrians possessed natural telepathic abilities that made communication and coordination effortless. The Vorthans had perfect recall and could process information at superhuman speeds. The crystalline Nexari could interface directly with technology through bioelectric fields. Humans had none of these advantages. They were slower, weaker, and apparently less intelligent than every other species in the Confederation. The test results proved it repeatedly. "I'm sorry, Dad," David said, finally, looking up. "I know how hard you worked to get us citizenship here after the colony raids." Marcus reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder. 5 years ago, the outer human colonies had been attacked by an unknown enemy. Billions had died before the Galactic Confederation intervened, offering sanctuary to the survivors in exchange for integration into their society. Marcus had lost everything in those attacks except David, and he'd spent 2 years navigating Confederation bureaucracy to secure their placement on Station Kepler-7. "It's not your fault," Marcus said firmly. "These tests weren't designed for us." "But they're supposed to be universal," David replied. "The Confederation has used them for 1,000 years to evaluate species compatibility. Every other race passes them easily." Before Marcus could respond, their communication panel chimed with an incoming priority message. The holographic seal of the Galactic Education Center materialized above the device, spinning slowly as it awaited acknowledgement. Marcus activated the message, and a 3-dimensional image of Administrator Thexbar appeared in their living room. The Nexari's crystalline form refracted light in prismatic patterns as she spoke, her voice resonating with harmonic undertones that human ears could barely process. "Citizen Chen," the administrator began, her words translated by the Universal Communication Matrix, "I am contacting all human families to inform you of an important development. The Confederation Council has voted to implement accelerated assessment protocols for human students." David's face went pale. "What does that mean?" "All human subjects between the ages of 15 and 20 will undergo intensive testing over the next 30 standard days," Administrator Thexbar continued. "Those who fail to achieve minimum Confederation standards will be reclassified as non-sentient entities and transferred to manual labor assignments in the outer systems." The message ended abruptly, leaving father and son in stunned silence. "Non-sentient entities?" David whispered. Marcus felt a cold rage building in his chest. He'd spent years studying Confederation law, trying to understand the system that now governed their lives. Non-sentient classification meant slavery in all but name. Humans who received the designation would lose all rights, all protections, and all hope of citizenship. "They can't do this," Marcus said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they could. Humanity was a probationary member at best, with no real political power within the Confederation. Over the following days, the situation became clear.
Human children across the Confederation were failing the accelerated tests at unprecedented rates.
News feeds carried stories of families being separated, with children shipped off to mining facilities and industrial complexes in distant systems.
The alien media coverage was particularly brutal.
A popular Zephyrian news program featured a segment titled The Human Problem, where experts discussed whether bringing humanity into the Confederation had been a mistake. A Vorthan academic named Dr. Kithiera became famous for her theory that humans represented an evolutionary dead end, a species that had peaked too early and now faced natural extinction. Perhaps, Dr. Kithiera explained to her audience, the attacks on their colonies were simply the universe correcting a biological error.
Some species are meant to survive, and others are not.
David watched these programs obsessively, each broadcast driving him deeper into despair. He stopped eating regularly and spent most of his time staring out the window at the alien ships that docked at the station daily, carrying cargo and passengers between the stars that humans could barely dream of reaching.
"I've been thinking," David said one evening as they sat down for dinner. "Maybe I should just accept the labor assignment.
At least then, you could stay here and maybe get full citizenship eventually."
"Absolutely not," Marcus replied immediately. "We stick together, no matter what."
"But, Dad, look at the test scores.
Look at everything they're saying about us. Maybe they're right. Maybe humans really are inferior."
Marcus set down his fork and looked directly at his son.
"David, I've spent my entire adult life working in xenoarchaeology, studying the remains of dead civilizations. Do you know what I've learned?" David shook his head. "Every single extinct species I've studied had one thing in common.
They all believed they understood the universe completely. They all thought they had figured out the rules, the patterns, the natural order of things." Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "The Confederation thinks they understand intelligence, compatibility, and evolution.
But they've never encountered anything like humanity before." "What do you mean?" "We're not just different, David. We're unprecedented.
Humans survived and thrived on a world that should have killed us 1,000,000 times over. We developed technology without telepathy, built civilizations without perfect recall, and reached the stars without bioelectric interfaces.
We did something that these alien species consider impossible."
David looked skeptical.
"If that's true, why do we keep failing their tests?"
"Because their tests measure the wrong things," Marcus said. "They test for the abilities that their own species developed, not for the abilities that actually matter." That night, Marcus made a decision.
He accessed the Confederation's historical databases, using his research credentials to dig deeper into galactic history than any human had before.
What he found confirmed his suspicions and filled him with a mixture of hope and dread.
The Galactic Confederation wasn't the first interstellar civilization. It was the third.
The first had been called the Dominion, a massive empire that had lasted for 10,000 years before collapsing in a single generation. The second, the Network, had survived for 5,000 years before suffering a similar fate. Both civilizations had left behind ruins, artifacts, and warnings about something they called the Trials. According to the fragmented records Marcus found, the Trials were a series of catastrophic events that periodically swept through the galaxy, testing civilizations for their worthiness to continue existing. The previous galactic powers had interpreted these events as natural disasters, random cosmic phenomena that happened to coincide with societal collapse. But Marcus saw a different pattern in the data.
The trials weren't random.
They were systematic, purposeful, and designed to test specific qualities that had nothing to do with intelligence or technological advancement. The ruins of both previous civilizations contained references to the weapon, an artifact of immense power that could only be activated by a species that possessed certain genetic and psychological characteristics. Both the Dominion and the Network had searched for this weapon desperately as their civilizations crumbled, but neither had been able to unlock its secrets. The Confederation had classified this information at the highest levels, marking it as irrelevant historical data that served no purpose except to fuel conspiracy theories and panic. But Marcus read between the lines and understood why they'd buried these records. The Confederation was afraid. They'd built their entire society around the belief that they represented the pinnacle of galactic evolution. The idea that their technological superiority and mental abilities might be irrelevant in the face of cosmic forces beyond their understanding threatened everything they believed about themselves. More importantly, the descriptions of the weapon and its requirements matched certain aspects of human physiology and psychology that the Confederation had dismissed as primitive traits. Marcus spent the next week verifying his research, cross-referencing data from dozens of archaeological sites.
The pattern became undeniable.
Humanity wasn't inferior to the Confederation species. They were different in ways that might prove crucial when the next trial arrived.
And, according to his calculations, that arrival was imminent.
The Confederation's own monitoring systems had detected anomalous readings from the galactic core, energy signatures that matched descriptions found in Dominion and network ruins. Something was stirring in the depths of space, something that had destroyed two previous civilizations and was now turning its attention toward the third. Marcus printed out his research and brought it to David, who was preparing for another round of aptitude tests.
"I want you to read this," Marcus said, handing over the thick stack of documents. "All of it."
David spent the entire night reading, and, by morning, his expression had completely changed. The despair was gone, replaced by something Marcus hadn't seen in months: hope.
"Is this real?" David asked. "All this stuff about previous civilizations and the weapon?"
"As real as anything can be when you're dealing with records that are thousands of years old," Marcus replied. "But the evidence is consistent across multiple sources and archaeological sites."
"So what do we do with this information?"
Marcus had been asking himself the same question. The Confederation would never listen to human theories about galactic history, especially not from the inferior species they were preparing to enslave. But there was another option, one that would require considerable risk.
"We find the weapon ourselves," Marcus said simply.
David stared at his father as if he'd lost his mind. "Dad, we're talking about searching an entire galaxy for an artifact that might not even exist. We don't have a ship, we don't have resources, and we barely have citizenship rights."
"Actually," Marcus said with a slight smile, "I think I know where it is."
He pulled out a star chart marked with dozens of red indicators. Every archaeological site associated with the trials contains references to the same location. They call it different names in different languages, but they're all describing the same place. A system at the confluence of three major hyperspace routes, marked by twin neutron stars and a planet that shouldn't exist.
David studied the chart. "The Kepler nexus? That's only 6 light-years from here."
"And it's also the site of the Confederation's most classified research facility," Marcus added. "A facility that's supposedly studying naturally occurring quantum phenomena but actually houses something much more interesting."
"How do you know all this?"
"Because I helped survey that system 15 years ago, before the Confederation claimed it," Marcus explained.
"We found ruins there, David. Massive, ancient ruins that predate anything in the galactic record."
"The Confederation classified our findings and sealed the system, but I kept copies of everything." David was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications.
"Even if you're right, even if the weapon is there, how would we possibly get access to it?"
"That facility is guarded by Confederation military forces. That's where your test failures might actually be an advantage," Marcus said.
"The Confederation is planning to ship failed human students to labor assignments in the outer systems."
"Those transport ships pass through the Kepler nexus for fuel and supply stops."
"You want me to deliberately fail the tests so I can get sent to a labor camp?"
"I want us both to get sent there," Marcus corrected.
"As your legal guardian, I have the right to accompany you to your assignment."
"Once we're on that transport ship, we'll have a chance to reach the facility."
"This is insane, Dad."
"We're talking about breaking into the most secure location in Confederation space, searching for a weapon that might be mythological, all based on your interpretation of ancient records that the Confederation's top scientists have already dismissed."
Marcus nodded. "Yes, it's insane.
It's also the only chance humanity has." David looked out the window again, watching an alien cargo ship dock at the station's central hub. For weeks, he'd seen those ships as symbols of everything humans couldn't achieve, reminders of their inferiority and impending slavery. Now, for the first time, he saw them as something else entirely.
Opportunity. "All right, David said finally. Let's find this weapon. The next morning, David walked into his final Confederation assessment with a completely different attitude.
Instead of desperately trying to pass tests designed for alien minds, he embraced his human nature completely. He answered questions honestly rather than trying to guess what the evaluators wanted to hear. He moved with natural human reflexes instead of attempting to mimic alien coordination patterns. The results were exactly what they'd expected. David scored even lower than before, earning the dubious distinction of achieving the worst test scores in Confederation history.
The Zephyrian proctor seemed almost pitying as she delivered the results.
I am sorry, young human, but these scores confirm that your species lacks the cognitive capabilities necessary for Confederation citizenship.
You will be transferred to Assignment Station Gamma 7 for manual labor duties. When do we leave?
David asked, his voice steady.
The transport departs tomorrow morning. As a minor, you may be accompanied by one guardian during transit.
That evening, Marcus and David packed their few possessions into regulation Confederation transport containers. Marcus carefully concealed his research data within seemingly mundane personal items, encoding the most critical information into the memory cores of their standard-issue communication devices. They spent their last night on Station Kepler 7 reviewing everything they knew about the Kepler Nexus, the ruins Marcus had discovered, and the theoretical requirements for activating the weapon. According to the ancient records, the artifact required not just specific genetic markers, but also particular psychological traits that had been bred out of most galactic species through millennia of technological dependence.
What if we're wrong about all this? David asked as they prepared for sleep. What if the weapon doesn't exist, or we can't activate it, or it doesn't do what the records suggest?
Marcus considered the question seriously. Then, we'll spend the rest of our lives in a Confederation labor camp, and humanity will be enslaved or exterminated within the next generation.
And if we're right?
If we're right, Marcus said, then we'll discover that humans aren't the failures the Confederation believes us to be. We'll prove that sometimes the species everyone considers inferior is actually exactly what the universe has been waiting for. David nodded and closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily.
Tomorrow would begin a journey that would either save his species or confirm their doom.
Either way, he was ready to face it with his father at his side and the hopes of humanity resting on their shoulders. The hidden facility, the Confederation transport ship Efficient Progress, was a study in alien engineering, its corridors designed with mathematical precision but no consideration for human comfort. Marcus and David found themselves packed into a cargo hold with 43 other human families, all bound for various labor assignments throughout Confederation space. The journey to Assignment Station Gamma 7 would take 12 days, with scheduled stops for fuel and supplies at 3 different Confederation facilities. According to the transport manifest that Marcus had quietly accessed through his archaeological research credentials, one of those stops would be the Kepler Nexus.
Their fellow passengers represented a cross-section of humanity's failure to integrate with galactic society. Engineers who couldn't interface with alien technology, teachers whose methods didn't match Confederation educational protocols, doctors whose treatment approaches violated galactic medical standards. Each family carried the weight of dreams destroyed by tests they'd never been designed to pass. Dr. Sarah Kim, a former university professor, sat with her 2 teenage daughters near the cargo hold's emergency systems panel. She'd been stripped of her teaching credentials after refusing to accept Confederation theories about human intellectual limitations. Her daughters had failed every standardized test, despite demonstrating remarkable creativity and problem-solving skills that the alien evaluators couldn't recognize.
They're shipping us out like cargo, Dr. Kim said quietly to Marcus as they shared a meager meal from Confederation ration dispensers.
25,000 humans sent to labor camps in the past month alone. They're systematically dismantling our society.
Not dismantling, Marcus corrected carefully.
Converting. Humans who accept their assessment become grateful workers. Those who resist get sent to facilities where resistance becomes irrelevant.
You sound like you have experience with Confederation psychology, Dr. Kim observed. Marcus glanced around the cargo hold, making sure their conversation couldn't be overheard by the transport's Vorthan security officers.
I've spent years studying how civilizations respond to existential threats. The Confederation isn't just managing humanity, they're managing their own fear. Fear of what?
Of discovering they might be wrong about everything they believe, Marcus replied. On the fourth day of their journey, the transport stopped at Nexus Station Alpha for routine maintenance and supply transfers. Marcus had hoped this might be their chance to access the Kepler system, but the station was located 2 light-years away from their target. They would need to wait for the second supply stop. During the layover, David made contact with some of the other human teenagers in the cargo hold. Most had given up hope, accepting their fate with the resigned despair that Confederation psychologists had identified as a positive indicator of successful labor camp integration. But a few still showed signs of the stubborn defiance that their captors found so problematic. Emma Rodriguez, Dr. Kim's older daughter, had been studying xenobiology before her test failures ended her academic career. She'd noticed something that the adult passengers had missed. "The security officers are nervous," Emma whispered to David during their daily exercise period in the ship's cramped recreation area.
"I've been watching their body language and biochemical stress indicators. Whatever they're transporting us toward, they're not happy about it." "What do you mean?" David asked.
"Vorthan physiology displays anxiety through subtle color changes in their cranial ridges," Emma explained. "Our guards have been showing consistent stress patterns for the past 2 days, ever since we left Nexus Station Alpha." David filed this information away and reported it to his father during their next private moment.
Marcus found Emma's observations intriguing, especially when combined with data he'd gathered from the transport's navigation systems.
"We're not following the standard route to Assignment Station Gamma 7, Marcus told David quietly.
"According to the navigational logs I've accessed, we've been diverted to a classified destination in the Kepler Nexus." "Why would they do that?"
"Because something's happening there," Marcus said. "Something significant enough to require additional human labor on short notice." The answer came on day 8 of their journey, when Captain Vextal made an unprecedented announcement to the human passengers. The transport's command center materialized a holographic projection in their cargo hold, showing the Nexari captain's crystalline form in full official regalia. "Human subjects," Captain Vextal began, his harmonic voice translated through universal communication matrices, "you are being diverted to an emergency work assignment at Research Facility Omega in the Kepler system.
Recent cosmic phenomena have created urgent requirements for additional manual labor in a high-radiation environment."
Dr. Kim raised her hand.
"What kind of cosmic phenomena?"
"Information regarding Confederation research activities is classified above your clearance level," the captain replied. "You will be briefed on your specific duties upon arrival." The hologram disappeared, leaving the human passengers to speculate about what awaited them. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and dread. This was the opportunity he'd hoped for, but the timing suggested that something had gone seriously wrong at the research facility. "High radiation environment," David repeated thoughtfully.
"That's not standard for Confederation research installations. Their technology usually prevents radiation exposure entirely."
"Unless," Marcus said slowly, "they've encountered something that their technology can't handle."
The next 3 days passed in tense anticipation.
The Vorthan security officers became increasingly agitated as they approached the Kepler system, their cranial ridges shifting through colors that Emma identified as indicating extreme stress and uncertainty. When they finally arrived at Research Facility Omega, the reason for this anxiety became immediately apparent. The facility was massive, built into and around an asteroid that had been hollowed out and converted into a research station. But, instead of the clean, geometric lines typical of Confederation architecture, the installation showed clear signs of hasty expansion and emergency modifications. Temporary structures jutted out from the asteroid's surface like metallic growths, and the entire complex pulsed with energy readings that made the transport's sensors emit continuous warning chimes.
"What is that?" David asked, staring out through the cargo hold's single viewport.
"That," Marcus said with growing excitement, "is what happens when someone finds something they weren't prepared for." The docking process took twice as long as normal, with Confederation traffic controllers issuing constant course corrections to keep the transport away from specific areas around the facility. Marcus counted at least 7 heavy Confederation warships stationed around the installation, their weapons systems powered and ready.
When the transport finally docked, the human passengers were processed through decontamination procedures far more extensive than anything they'd experienced before.
They were given radiation suits, personal monitoring devices, and strict instructions about forbidden areas within the facility. The briefing chamber was a testament to Confederation engineering, with holographic displays showing detailed maps of the research complex. Dr. Thaindoke, the Nexary facility commander, addressed the new arrivals with barely concealed frustration. "You will be assigned to excavation duties in sectors 7 through 12, Dr. Thaindoke explained. These areas contain archaeological material that requires careful extraction. Your human physiological resilience to radiation makes you suitable for this work." Dr. Kim raised her hand again. "What kind of archaeological material?" "Artifacts of unknown origin," the commander replied tersely. "Some date back several million years. All are classified at the highest Confederation security levels." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Artifacts millions of years old, in a system that Confederation records claimed had only been colonized within the past century. They'd found something significant, something that challenged their understanding of galactic history. "You will work in rotating shifts to minimize radiation exposure," Dr. Thaindoke continued. "Any unauthorized discussion of your discoveries will result in immediate memory modification and permanent labor assignment." The human workers were assigned to barracks built into the asteroid's lower levels, far from the facility's main research areas. The accommodations were Spartan but functional, clearly designed for temporary housing rather than permanent residence. Marcus and David found themselves sharing quarters with Dr. Kim and her daughters, along with 2 other families. Their first night in the facility, Marcus used his archaeological credentials to access the base computer network from a maintenance terminal. What he found exceeded his most optimistic expectations. The Confederation had discovered ruins beneath the asteroid's surface, structures that predated their own civilization by millions of years. But these weren't the crumbling remnants typically found at archaeological sites. These ruins were intact, pristine, and actively responding to Confederation attempts at exploration. According to the classified research logs Marcus accessed, the facility's scientists had been studying the ruins for 6 months. They'd found evidence of advanced technology, mathematical principles that challenged existing scientific understanding, and, most importantly, references to something called the Guardian Protocol. The protocol appeared to be a defensive system designed to protect the ruins from unauthorized access. Every attempt at deep exploration had triggered increasingly violent responses from the ancient mechanisms. 3 Confederation research teams had already been lost to what the reports described as incompatible energy discharges. But the most intriguing discovery was a chamber at the ruin's heart, sealed behind barriers that wouldn't respond to any known technology. The chamber contained what appeared to be a weapon of enormous power, along with control systems that required specific genetic and psychological characteristics to activate. The Confederation's xenobiologists had tested representatives from all 7 member species, but none could interface with the ancient controls. The weapon remained sealed, tantalizingly close but completely inaccessible. "They found it," Marcus whispered to David as he shared his discoveries. "The weapon from the ancient records. It's here, it's real, and they can't figure out how to use it. That's why they need human workers," David realized. "They're hoping that human genetic diversity might include whatever characteristics the weapon requires." "Exactly. But they don't understand what they're looking for. They're treating this like a standard xenoarchaeological investigation, when they should be approaching it as a test of species compatibility." Over the next few days, Marcus and David were assigned to different excavation teams, giving them opportunities to observe the ruins firsthand. The ancient structures were breathtaking in their complexity, incorporating architectural principles that seemed to defy gravity and physics. Crystalline formations grew throughout the walls, pulsing with inner light and responding to human presence in ways that Confederation monitoring equipment couldn't detect. David's team was working in Sector 11, closest to the sealed chamber that contained the weapon. He noticed immediately that the ruins responded differently to humans than to the Confederation research staff. Where Nexary scientists triggered defensive reactions from the ancient systems, humans seemed to calm them. "It's like the place recognizes us," David told his father during their off-shift period. "Not as individuals, but as a species. The energy patterns shift when humans are present, becoming more stable and less hostile." Marcus had observed similar phenomena in his own sector.
The ruins aren't just archaeological remnants, David. They're still functional, still waiting for something. The question is, what are they waiting for? The answer came during David's fourth day on excavation duty. His team had been assigned to clear debris from a corridor leading toward the sealed chamber when the ancient system suddenly activated. Instead of the violent defensive responses that had killed Confederation researchers, the ruins' crystalline formations began emitting harmonious tones that seemed to resonate with human brainwave patterns. The Nexari team supervisor, Dr. Kethmar, immediately ordered the humans to evacuate the corridor. But David hesitated, drawn by something he couldn't quite understand. The crystalline formations were forming patterns of light that looked almost like writing, symbols that seemed familiar despite being completely alien. Human subject designate David 7739, Dr. Kethmar commanded through his translation device, "You will evacuate this area immediately." But David found himself moving closer to the wall instead of away from it. The light patterns were definitely some form of communication, and they were directed specifically at him. Without conscious thought, he placed his hand against one of the larger crystals. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Information flooded David's consciousness, not as words or images, but as pure understanding. He saw the history of the galaxy spanning millions of years, the rise and fall of civilizations, the cosmic cycles that brought order and chaos in equal measure. He saw the trials, massive cosmic events that tested galactic civilizations for their worthiness to continue existing. He understood that intelligence, technology, and power meant nothing in the face of these tests. What mattered was adaptability, resilience, and the ability to sacrifice for the greater good. He saw why the Dominion and Network had fallen despite their vast achievements. They had become too specialized, too dependent on their particular advantages. When the trials came, they couldn't adapt quickly enough to survive. And he saw why the ruins had been waiting, why the weapon could only be activated by a species that possessed certain genetic and psychological traits. The ancient builders had created it not as a tool of conquest, but as a test of character. The vision lasted only seconds in real time, but when David opened his eyes, he found the entire excavation team staring at him in stunned silence. The crystalline formations throughout the corridor were now glowing with steady light, and the sealed barriers leading to the central chamber had begun to dissolve. Dr. Kethmar was speaking rapidly into his communication device, calling for immediate backup and requesting instructions from Facility Command. But David barely heard him. He was focused on the pathway that had opened before them, the route to the weapon that had remained sealed for millions of years. "David," Marcus called, pushing through the crowd of confused researchers and security personnel. "What happened? What did you do?" "I made contact," David replied, his voice carrying a strange confidence that hadn't been there before. "The ruins aren't just archaeological sites, Dad. They're guardians. And they've been waiting for us." Before anyone could stop him, David walked through the dissolved barriers and into the central chamber. Marcus followed immediately, with Dr. Kim and several other humans close behind. The Confederation personnel seemed paralyzed by the unprecedented situation, their protocols offering no guidance for handling ancient technology that responded to failed test subjects. The central chamber was vast, its walls covered with the same crystalline formations they'd seen throughout the ruins. In the center stood a pedestal supporting what could only be the weapon described in the ancient records. It wasn't a traditional weapon at all, but rather a sphere of dark metal covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. "Incredible," Dr. Kim breathed, her scientific training overcoming her awe. "The mathematical principles governing this chamber are beyond anything in our current understanding. It's like reality itself has been modified to accommodate this technology." David approached the pedestal slowly, feeling the same resonance he'd experienced with the corridor crystals. The patterns on the sphere were definitely a form of interface, but not one designed for any technology the galaxy currently possessed. This was something far older and far more sophisticated. "David, be careful," Marcus warned. "We don't know what this thing is capable of." "Yes, we do," David replied. "It's a test. The final test. And I think I understand what it's testing for." He reached out and placed both hands on the sphere's surface. The response was immediate and dramatic. Energy surged through the chamber,
causing the crystalline formations to pulse in synchronized patterns.
The sphere itself began to change, its surface becoming transparent and revealing complex mechanisms within.
But, most importantly, David felt the weapon probing his mind and genetic structure, evaluating him according to criteria established millions of years ago. He understood now why the Confederation species had failed this test. They had evolved beyond the characteristics that the weapon required. Their advantages in telepathy, perfect recall, and technological integration had actually disqualified them from activating the ancient artifact. Humans, on the other hand, had retained the raw adaptability and emotional depth that the weapons builders had programmed as essential requirements. Their supposed inferiority was actually their greatest strength. The probing continued for several minutes, during which the facility's alarm systems began wailing and Confederation security forces surrounded the chamber. But none of the aliens dared to interfere with what was happening, partly from caution and partly from a growing realization that they were witnessing something beyond their comprehension.
Finally, the sphere's evaluation was complete.
David felt a surge of approval from the ancient intelligence that controlled the weapon, followed by the gradual transfer of knowledge about its purpose and capabilities.
The weapon wasn't designed to destroy enemies or conquer territories.
It was a tool for reshaping reality itself, for giving its user the ability to modify the fundamental laws of physics within localized areas. In the right hands, it could end conflicts without violence, solve resource shortages by altering matter at the subatomic level, and even prevent cosmic catastrophes like the trials. But it would only respond to a species that demonstrated the psychological maturity to use such power responsibly. A species that had learned to survive through cooperation rather than dominance, adaptation rather than specialization, and sacrifice rather than selfishness. David opened his eyes and found himself looking at Marcus, Dr. Kim, and the assembled Confederation personnel with new understanding. The weapon had accepted him as its wielder, but, more importantly, it had confirmed everything his father had theorized about humanity's role in galactic history. The Confederation was wrong, David said simply. About humans, about intelligence, about everything that really matters. Before anyone could respond, the facility's communication systems crackled to life with an urgent message from Confederation Command. Deep space monitoring stations had detected massive energy signatures emerging from the galactic core, phenomena matching historical descriptions of the approach of the trials. The third galactic civilization was about to face the same test that had destroyed its predecessors. And, for the first time in cosmic history, the galaxy possessed both the weapon necessary to survive that test and a species capable of wielding it effectively. The real challenge was about to begin.
The Confederation's response to David's successful activation of the weapon was swift and predictable.
Within hours of the ancient artifact acknowledging him as its wielder, Research Facility Omega was swarming with Confederation military vessels, scientific teams, and political representatives from all 7 member species. David found himself confined to the chamber containing the weapon, not as a prisoner, but as the galaxy's most valuable asset.
The sphere remained active in his presence, its surface displaying complex readouts that Confederation scientists desperately tried to decipher. But, without David's direct interaction, the ancient technology was completely inert.
The energy signatures from the galactic core are accelerating, Admiral Fexnal announced during an emergency briefing held in the facility's main conference chamber. The massive Zephyrian commander's telepathic fields crackled with barely controlled anxiety as she addressed the assembled Confederation leadership. Our deep space monitoring arrays are detecting phenomena that match historical descriptions of trial manifestations.
Supreme Chancellor VYX Terra, speaking for the Confederation Council, studied the holographic displays showing energy readings from across the galaxy.
The elderly Vorthan's perfect recall allowed her to process vast amounts of data simultaneously, but her expression suggested that perfect memory was more curse than blessing when reviewing the fate of previous galactic civilizations. How long before these phenomena reach populated systems, she asked. Current projections indicate first contact with outer colonies within 60 standard days, Admiral Fexnal replied. Full galactic impact within 100 days. Dr. Kethmar, who had been studying the weapon's interactions with David, stepped forward with his preliminary analysis. The ancient artifact appears to be specifically designed to counter trial phenomena.
However, its activation requires continuous interface with the human subject. We cannot simply study and replicate the technology.
Marcus watched the proceedings from the back of the chamber, officially present as David's legal guardian but effectively ignored by the alien leadership.
He understood the Confederation's dilemma perfectly.
They needed human cooperation to access their only hope of survival, but acknowledging humanity as equals would undermine everything their society believed about itself.
Has the human subject demonstrated any aggressive intentions regarding the weapon? Chancellor VYX Terra asked.
Our psychological profiles suggest that humans possess concerning tendencies toward violence and territorial expansion.
The weapon doesn't respond to aggressive impulses, Dr. Kethmar admitted reluctantly.
In fact, it seems to actively screen against such motivations. The human subject shows remarkable psychological stability when interfacing with the technology. This assessment clearly troubled the Confederation leadership. Their entire justification for human subjugation rested on the premise that humans were inherently inferior and dangerous. The possibility that the weapon actually preferred human psychological traits to their own was deeply threatening to their worldview.
We need to understand the weapon's capabilities before committing to any course of action, Chancellor VYX Terra declared.
Dr. Kethmar, you will work with the human subject to explore the artifact's functions and limitations. Over the following days, David found himself at the center of the galaxy's most important research project. The weapon responded to his intentions and emotions, manifesting its power in ways that Confederation scientists struggled to comprehend. It could manipulate matter at the quantum level, create energy fields that defied known physics, and, most remarkably, project its influence across vast distances through what appeared to be folded space. But the weapon's most important capability was its ability to interface with the cosmic forces behind the trials. When David focused on the approaching energy signatures from the galactic core, the weapon showed him visions of what was coming.
The trials weren't random cosmic events or natural disasters.
They were deliberate tests administered by intelligences so ancient and powerful that they existed outside normal space and time. These beings had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, periodically culling those that failed to demonstrate the qualities necessary for true cosmic citizenship. "They're coming to evaluate us," David explained to the assembled research team after one of his interface sessions.
"All of us.
Humans, Confederation species, everyone.
The question isn't whether we're technologically advanced or mentally superior.
The question is whether we've learned to work together when it truly matters." Dr. Kithiera, the Vorthan academic who had become famous for her theories about human inferiority, studied the readouts from David's session with growing dismay.
The weapon's projections suggest that individual species advancement is irrelevant to these cosmic evaluators. They're assessing our collective civilization.
Which means, Marcus interjected from his position as an observer, that humanity's supposed failures might actually be advantages. "We've learned to adapt and cooperate because we've had to. We've never had the luxury of believing we were inherently superior to anyone else."
This observation created an uncomfortable silence in the chamber.
The Confederation's entire social structure was built on the premise of species hierarchy, with each race occupying a specific position based on their perceived capabilities. The possibility that this hierarchy was not only wrong but actively counterproductive challenged everything they believed about themselves. The debate was interrupted by urgent communications from Confederation monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. The trial phenomena were accelerating beyond all projections, with the first manifestations appearing in outer systems weeks ahead of schedule.
The reports were terrifying in their consistency. Entire star systems were being subjected to tests that defied comprehension.
Planets found their orbital mechanics altered to create impossible survival scenarios. Space stations discovered that their life support systems would only function if the inhabitants demonstrated specific behavioral patterns. Military fleets encountered energy barriers that could only be crossed through acts of genuine sacrifice. Most disturbing of all, the tests seemed specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of Confederation society.
Species that relied on telepathic communication found themselves unable to connect.
Perfect recall became a liability when individuals became paralyzed by awareness of every possible failure scenario.
Technological integration backfired when artificial systems began demanding moral justifications for their continued operation.
The ancient evaluators understand us better than we understand ourselves, David reported after accessing data from the affected systems through the weapon's cosmic interface capabilities. They know exactly what each species considers impossible, and they're forcing us to do those things anyway. Admiral Fexnal's telepathic fields had stabilized into patterns that Confederation psychologists associated with defeat and despair. Our military forces are reporting 60% casualty rates in affected systems, with most losses due to inability to adapt to altered physical laws rather than direct enemy action. Because you're fighting the wrong kind of battle, David said quietly. You're trying to overcome these challenges through superior technology and individual capability. But the tests aren't designed to reward those qualities. Then, what are they designed to reward? Chancellor VYX Terra demanded. David placed his hands on the weapon's surface and accessed the cosmic intelligences directly. The answer came not as words, but as pure understanding that he struggled to translate into concepts the Confederation could grasp. Unity, he said finally. Not political unity or social unity, but something deeper. The willingness to sacrifice personal advantage for collective survival. The ability to see beyond species barriers when facing existential threats. The wisdom to know when traditional solutions don't work and the courage to try something completely different. Dr. Kim, who had been studying the weapon's internal mechanisms, looked up from her analysis with sudden comprehension. That's why the weapon shows humans. Not because we're superior, but because we're used to being considered inferior. We've had to learn these lessons that the Confederation never needed to learn. Until now, Marcus added grimly. The next phase of the trials began 3 days later, when the cosmic phenomena reached Confederation core systems. The capital world of Nexus Prime found its gravity fluctuating according to patterns that could only be stabilized through coordinated action from all 7 species working together. The Confederation's most important research facilities discovered that their equipment would only function when operated by mixed species teams that included humans in leadership roles. Most challenging of all, the weapon itself began demanding proof that the Confederation was worthy of salvation. David found that his interface capabilities were diminishing unless he could demonstrate that the galaxy's dominant civilization was capable of genuine change. The weapon is testing us too, David reported to an emergency session of the Confederation Council. It won't provide its full protection unless we can prove we've learned the lessons that previous galactic civilizations failed to master. What kind of proof does it require? Chancellor VYX Terra asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Integration, David replied. Real integration, not the superficial cooperation the Confederation has practiced for the past 1,000 years. Species barriers need to disappear entirely. Decision-making authority needs to be distributed based on capability rather than genetic heritage. And humans need to be recognized not as failed aliens, but as equal partners in galactic civilization. The political implications of this requirement caused an immediate uproar among the Confederation representatives. Admiral Fexnal's telepathic field spiked with outrage. You're demanding that we restructure our entire society to accommodate the preferences of a failed species that couldn't pass basic competency assessments. No, David said calmly. I'm telling you what the cosmic evaluators require for our collective survival. You can accept it, or you can face the trials with the same methods that failed the previous 2 galactic civilizations. The debate continued for hours, with each species arguing for maintaining their traditional advantages while expecting others to make sacrifices. But, as more reports arrived from systems experiencing trial phenomena, the futility of their approach became increasingly apparent. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kithira, the academic who had spent years advocating for human subjugation, accessed the weapon's historical database and discovered records of the Dominion's final days. The previous galactic civilization had possessed technology far superior to anything the Confederation had achieved, but they had faced the same choice between adaptation and extinction. They chose extinction, Dr. Kithira announced to the stunned council. Rather than accept fundamental changes to their society, the Dominion leadership decided to face the trials with traditional methods. The cosmic evaluators found them unworthy of continuation. And the network? Chancellor VYX Terra asked. Made partial reforms that proved insufficient, Dr. Kithira continued. They integrated some species into leadership roles but maintained hierarchical structures based on perceived superiority. The evaluators judged them as improved but still unworthy.
The implications were clear. The Confederation faced the same choice their predecessors had confronted: evolve or die.
But evolution required admitting that their fundamental assumptions about intelligence, capability, and species value were wrong. The decision came when the trial phenomena reached Nexus Prime itself, the Confederation capital. The planet's entire population found themselves trapped in a scenario where survival required unprecedented cooperation between species that had never considered each other equals. David accessed the weapon's full capabilities for the first time, projecting its influence across the galaxy to provide protection for Confederation worlds that demonstrated genuine unity. But he also had to deny protection to systems that continued to cling to traditional hierarchies and species-based discrimination. The message was unmistakable: adapt or face extinction. Within 48 hours, the Confederation Council voted unanimously to restructure galactic civilization according to the principles the weapon demanded. Species barriers were officially abolished, with citizenship and authority distributed based on individual capability rather than genetic heritage. Humans were granted full membership in the galactic community, with many of their supposedly failed test subjects appointed to leadership positions in critical sectors. David Chen, the teenager who had failed every Confederation assessment, found himself appointed as the galaxy's first director of cosmic defense, responsible for coordinating the use of the weapon against trial phenomena. But the real test came when the cosmic evaluators themselves arrived in the galaxy's core systems, manifesting as entities of pure energy that existed partially outside normal space and time. They subjected the reformed Confederation to final assessments that required not just organizational changes, but genuine psychological evolution. Species that had spent millennia believing in their own superiority had to demonstrate humility. Civilizations built on technological advancement had to show wisdom in the face of forces beyond their comprehension. And, most importantly, the galaxy's inhabitants had to prove they could think beyond their own species' survival to consider the welfare of the cosmic community as a whole. The evaluators' tests were more subtle but more demanding than anything the galaxy had experienced. They created scenarios where the only correct response was to sacrifice individual or species advantage for the greater good. They presented moral dilemmas that had no technologically sophisticated solutions, only choices between competing values. David found himself serving not just as the weapon's wielder, but as a translator between the cosmic evaluators and the confused Confederation leadership. His human background, with its emphasis on adaptability and cooperation born from necessity, allowed him to understand both perspectives in ways that the traditionally superior species could not. "They're not trying to destroy us," David explained to a joint session of the Reformed Galactic Council. "They're trying to determine whether we've developed enough to join the cosmic community that exists beyond our galaxy." The Dominion and Network failed because they couldn't move beyond local concerns to universal ones. The final test came when the evaluators revealed the truth about the trials themselves. The cosmic phenomena weren't punishment or random disaster, but graduation exercises administered by a community of advanced civilizations that spanned multiple galaxies. Species that passed the tests were invited to join this larger community and gain access to knowledge and capabilities that made their previous achievements look primitive. But membership in this cosmic community required sacrificing the very qualities that most civilizations considered their greatest strengths. Technological superiority, genetic advantages, and cultural dominance all became irrelevant in the face of universal principles that prioritized wisdom, adaptability, and genuine cooperation. The Confederation's response to this revelation demonstrated how completely their perspective had changed. Instead of demanding special consideration based on their historical achievements, they asked what they could contribute to the cosmic community's goals. The answer surprised everyone, including the human representatives who had become instrumental in the galaxy's transformation. "Your greatest contribution," the lead evaluator communicated through David's interface with the weapon, "is your newest member species. Humans represent a form of adaptive resilience that our community has not encountered before. Their ability to find strength in perceived weakness, unity in diversity, and hope in adversity makes them valuable ambassadors to other galaxies facing similar challenges." The final irony was that humanity's supposed inferiority had been their greatest qualification for cosmic citizenship. Their failures on Confederation assessments had actually been evidence of capabilities that the galaxy's dominant species had evolved beyond. 6 months later, David stood in the redesigned Confederation Council chambers, watching representatives from dozens of species work together on challenges that would have seemed impossible under the old system. Humans served alongside Zephyrians, Vorthans, Nexari, and others in roles distributed according to individual capability rather than species characteristics.
Dr.
Kithiera, who now served as Director of Interspecies Integration, approached David with a report on the galaxy's progress toward full cosmic community membership.
"The evaluators have approved our preliminary application," she announced. "We'll be granted provisional membership within the next standard year." "And then?" David asked.
"Then, we get to help other galaxies face their own trials," Dr. Kithiera replied with a smile that would have been impossible under the old Confederation system.
"Apparently, teaching cosmic evolution is considered an advanced responsibility."
David nodded, understanding the elegant justice of the situation. The galaxy that had once prepared to enslave humanity for its supposed inferiority would now depend on human psychological insights to guide other civilizations through the same transformation they had undergone. The weapon remained active on its pedestal in the Kepler Nexus facility, no longer needed for defense against the trials but maintained as a symbol of what the galaxy had learned. Its ancient technology served as a reminder that true strength came not from individual superiority, but from the wisdom to recognize when everything you believed about yourself needed to change. Marcus Chen, watching his son work with beings from across the galaxy to solve challenges that transcended species boundaries, reflected on how completely their circumstances had transformed. A year ago, they had been considered failures by the galaxy's dominant civilization. Now, they were leading that same civilization toward a future none of them could have imagined. "The aliens laughed when they said you couldn't pass a single test," Marcus said to David during one of their regular private conversations. "I wonder what they think about those test scores now." David smiled, remembering the Zephyrian proctor who had delivered his assessment with such finality.
"I think they've learned that the most important tests aren't the ones anyone designs on purpose.
They're the ones that life creates when you least expect them, and they measure things that can't be quantified in any standard assessment."
Outside their window, ships from the cosmic community were arriving to begin the galaxy's orientation toward universal citizenship.
The failed human test subject who had triggered a legendary weapon was now preparing to help transform other civilizations, using the very qualities that had once marked him as inferior. The greatest test of all had been passed not through superior performance, but through the recognition that performance itself was the wrong standard for measuring worth. And, in learning that lesson, the galaxy had discovered that its supposedly weakest members were actually the key to its ultimate strength.